Welcome everyone. I see a whole bunch of faces that I already know. Is there anyone that's new to Sankofa today? All right, welcome. How'd y'all find out about us?
Just word of mouth, living in DMV.
Okay, thank you for being here. We're so happy to have this program for you today. Thanks to Dr. Joshua Myers, Friends of the Storms, always bringing us great people, great academics, and great subject matter. Today we're presenting Blacksound, Making Race in Popular Music in the United States by Matthew Morrison. A little bit about Dr. Matthew Morrison. He's a native of Charlotte, North Carolina. He's a musicologist, a violinist, and associate professor in the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Did I pronounce Tisch correctly?
Right on.
We'll be in conversation with Dr. Joshua Myers, who I said again is a friend of the store. He has many different titles. He just released his latest, which is a work of poetry called The Holy Ghost Key, which both books can be bought here tonight. I'm not going to hold us up too much longer. I'm just going to pass the mic over to Dr. Joshua Myers. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you both for being here.
How's everybody doing?
Yes, please.
How's everybody doing? All right, it's good. I'm doing fine. It's a beautiful day. A lot going on in the month of April. Poetry month and jazz month and all kinds of months. Last few weeks too. So Matthew actually lectured at Howard on this subject. I guess it was November. Yeah. This past November, and I skipped my office hours to go see it because I had read an article version of this concept of Blacksound. I had been looking forward to the book for many months. We followed each other on social media about 3 or 4 maybe longer, and been following each other's work that way. And so it was good to be in conversation with him over at the Fine Arts Building at Howard, talking about some of the implications of this. I still remember my question that I raised there about this concept of Blacksound, and we'll get into some of that. But this book, as someone who tries to avoid pop music as much as I can, at least 98.5% of it, I now have some theoretical ballast to give people as to why I do avoid much of it. And I say that tongue in cheek, but it's really important for us to understand that as much as people like to say, well, everything's not about race. When it comes to the American popular culture industry, it seems like everything's about race. Right. And Matthew has given us a book that walks us through how popular music is never not about race in America. And I would probably extend that to the world, but we haven't done that research yet. Right. But certainly in America, right, the modern nation state of the United States of America, popular music is inherently about race. And so, having said that, I think it's best that we start with the video that'll give us a further declaration and understanding of that, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of the text itself.
Thank you so much.
Want to introduce this?
Yes, absolutely. I'll introduce this. Thank you very much, y'all, for being here. I appreciate you taking the time out of this beautiful Saturday afternoon, and to Sankofa for hosting me, Michaela as well, for helping to organize, and to my colleague and friend, Dr. Josh Myers. It is really, really wonderful to be here in this space. As I said to Josh, this is on my, taking my book around and giving presentations and talking about the work. This is the only bookstore that I'm on this spring because I'm actually most interested in going to talk to Black folks at Black bookstores. So I'm glad for this to be the first stop on that trajectory. So I appreciate y'all. But so this is an animation of the concept of Blacksound. So Blacksound is the title of my book. The full title, Blacksound, Making Race in Popular Music in the United States. But it's named after a concept that I began to work on in graduate school, trying to figure out what is the legacy of blackface minstrelsy and shaping so many different facets of American popular culture, music, entertainment, and politics. And how has that legacy been erased? And then what does that mean for us today, right? And so to try to also get this knotty, thorny concept, into the hands of people, came up with this animation and video along with Kindia Labs. So I'd like to share that with you all that gives sort of a breakdown of what Blacksound as a general concept is supposed to convey or suggest. The foundation of commercial sound.
I think there's something you have to do.
Okay. What about the sound? Is there sound on the sound?
Is nothing coming out at all?
It's coming out.
The music in the United States begins with black-based minstrelsy, the nation's first original form.
So I'll start it over and I'll also put the closed captions on.
The foundation of commercial popular music in the United States begins with black-based minstrelsy, the nation's first original form of popular musical entertainment. Blackface was developed during slavery in the 1820s when European American white men, especially from Ireland, Scotland, and England, darkened their faces with burnt cork, employed a broken English dialect, and developed a new musical form that combined their own European ethnic performances with their often racist interpretations of black people, as well as their sounds and movements. As blackface established itself as the most popular.
Okay.
Reading.
All right. The foundation of commercial popular music in the United States begins with blackface minstrelsy, the nation's first original form of popular musical entertainment. Blackface was developed during slavery in the 1820s when European American white men, especially from Ireland, Scotland, and England, darkened their faces with burnt cork, employed a broken English dialect, and developed a new musical form that combined their own European ethnic folk performances with their often racist interpretations of black people, as well as their sounds and movements. As blackface established itself as the most popular form of musical, theatrical, and comedic entertainment throughout the 19th century, it eventually began to shape the developing commercial and entertainment industry from vaudeville and bluegrass all the way to EDM and hip-hop. Blackface also helped to lay the foundation for the emergence of music technologies, including the phonograph, records, radio, film, television, MP3s, and streaming. Although blackface is the commercial and aesthetic basis of popular music and entertainment in the United States, its long impact on American entertainment and racial identity formation has mostly been minimized or erased from cultural memory, especially after the act of blackening one's face became a taboo practice under the pressure of the civil rights movement. To highlight the continued legacy of blackface beyond the burnt cork mask, I developed Blacksound as a concept to trace the sonic and embodied legacy of blackface performance that serves as the aesthetic, racial, political, and intellectual property basis of all commercial American popular music and entertainment. The aesthetics of Blacksound are rooted in the real and imagined performance practices of African Americans that have been combined with the sounds of other ethnicities to create and market commercial popular music. The concept of Blacksound is also a tool to unpack the political and cultural stakes of a multi-billion-dollar U.S. music industry with global impact that has remained primarily under the control of white music industrialists from slavery into the present.
Should I go?
Oh, please. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that's actually really, as someone who read the book before I saw that, that's like a perfect, quick distillation of what this book is really doing. And I just want to get into some of my juicy questions. Because it's so rich, this book is rich with theoretical insight. As someone who dabbles in music and like around the fringes, I found that your ability to distill these complex ideas about theory into your concept of Blacksound was fascinating. But it's also full of these really effective biographical treatments of people that a lot of us think we know a lot about, or we don't know anything about, right? So T.D. Rice, the originator of the idea of Jim Crow, George Washington Dixon, the originator of the idea of zip coon, the Whitmarks and Tin Pan Alley, and Stephen Foster, also Master Juba, William Henry Lane, and someone who is new to me, George Washington Johnson, one of the earliest Black recorded artists. And so there's that. But the thing that I've been telling people about this book is that we know what we think we know about blackface when we see it, right? When we see it, it immediately registers, oh, that's minstrelsy, that's blackface minstrelsy. But you've identified that every time you see, or the visual has a sound to it, there is a corresponding identifiable sound that's attached to that imagery. Can you talk about how you came to identify that and what that sound is and what it sounds like?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's very significant for me to have someone like Josh Myers, who I respect very much as a brilliant intellectual and writer and thinker, and also a critic. You know what I mean? Like, Josh don't play around when it comes to really analyzing text. So, and my man don't fake the funk. So I really do appreciate the reading of the book in this way. I really do. And so so because blackface is something, and again, I think it's Josh very smartly pointed out, that we recognize right away, and then because we can recognize it as violent or as like misrepresentational, we can kind of be like, all right, well, push that thing to the side. We know it's racist, and like, get it out of here. What do we do with that? But I think something that even Josh's questions before and now have helped me to even better understand is that whether or not the visual mask is there, if we are listening to one another speak, right, if we're interpreting how the other person is supposed to sound or move in our own minds, if we are listening to some aspect of popular music or music in general in the United States, there are resonances of blackface there, right? And so I was trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? And why do I think it's so important? Well, I was like, oh, because it's very easy to sort of recognize the violent act of sort of taking up blackness, whether real or imagined, right? Through this sort of rehearsal of a act, but we don't see the same sort of violence. In fact, sometimes we lean into it when people, who don't look a certain way, take up sounds that are associated with blackness and then become sort of, a whole entire, Jack Harlow on them right away. I don't know if you know who Jack Harlow is, and probably one of the most famed rappers right now, right? So at any rate, so what Blacksound is for me and how I came to it was trying to figure out, how do I communicate this thing that I know in my body, that I know as a performer, as a Black person, as a person from the South, as a classical musician, violinist, as well as someone raised in a Black church and raised in different Black traditions. Like, how do I recognize all of these different sort of conflicts that people place on me from the outside around, like, oh, you play the violin, or well, if you play the violin, then you must not know about this type of thing. I'm like, why do all these assumptions come up, right? And so through those assumptions and my own experiences as a performer, and then also just looking at the industry and how clearly so many different styles, and we all know this, every style of pop music that we sort of listen to is connected to some legacy of Black music. But again, what does that mean, right? Especially when that legacy of Black music is steeped in our history, which is steeped in slavery, right? And this legacy, which all began at the same time that blackface emerged, right? So I was trying to bring together those initial moments, and then also keep in mind the different ways that we continue to innovate and improvise and express new ideas of pop music, even in the face of, the continued exploitation and use of our bodies and creative practices as commodities.
And I think there's an important distinction. I want everybody to be clear on this, right? The concept of Black sound is not synonymous with Black music.
Right.
It's not synonymous with Black Sound's 2 words,
Exactly.
right? And so walk us through that difference, because I think people might pick up this book and think that, oh, this is an ethnomusicology of African music making. No, it's not. It's about the appropriation and exploitation of what they think or what they thought or what they imagined as Black sounds, but was not synonymous with Black sounds.
Yes, that's very important. Thank you for that, Josh. So as y'all can see on the book, so Black Sound, the concept I'm talking about, is one word with a capital B on it, right? Which, as Josh pointed out very clearly here, and not trying to note there, it's not the same as Black sounds, 2 different words, right? Because those are literally any sounds coming from Black people, right? Again, whether, like I said, violinist, or whether you playing the pipe, or whether you playing the bagpipe, or whether you playing the gora, whether you play like that, those are Black sounds, right? Now, there are certain sounds of Black people that we begin to sort of recognize over time as authentic, right? So even though, for example, the violin has been something that has been as present in Black life in the United States as long as we've been here. Frederick Douglass was a violinist, right? His grandson, Joseph Douglass, was a violinist. We don't immediately associate that sound with Black people because of the sort of rehearsal or the investment in certain types of sounds being connected to Blackness, something like the drum, for example, right? Which is, but it's one of the many Black sounds that come from Black creative practices, right? So this is what I mean, and we're pointing out here that, you know, Black sounds, 2 words, the multitude of sounds that Black people create, which we know can be and is endless, right? But Black sound, capital B, 1 word, what I wanted to make sure of is that never could we talk about American popular music, which is also the basis of global popular music, just to put a pin in that. Blackface traveled to the United Kingdom, to Japan, to South Africa, to India, okay, in the mid-20th, in the mid-19th century, right? So before emancipation, there were people across the water representing Black folks who were enslaved primarily, right? And saying that this is what Blackness is, as they were also expressing Americanness and American entertainment at the same time, you know what I mean? So this, like this weird juxtaposition of using Blackness or exploiting it, but then also like actually taking like Black performances, and the more we get towards emancipation, and the more we get towards quote integration, right? The more you have actual Black sounds of Black people that begin to shape these exploitative systems, but by that time, they are fully under the control of the sort of white supremacist structures that shape every other system and industry that are part of the United States, right? So Black sound is an attempt to capture the idea that no matter what we are doing, we can never get away from the resonance of Blackness in the making of American popular music, which just doesn't mean that, oh, all American music is Black music. Well, if that is the case, then what does that mean that so many, that this, I should have said multi-trillion-dollar industry, right? Reparations, hello, there are so many things that that we have funded, right? And the commercial music industry is one of the largest of those, right? And so like really trying to make clear that not only are the sort of structures of American popular music developed out of this exploitative model, but the literal aesthetics and sounds are also coming from taking the local sounds. So think about like early ragtime that then becomes the basis of Tin Pan Alley, and then how the blues becomes sort of the basis of, how race music and the blues becomes the basis of hillbilly music and country music, and then jazz, sort of becomes the structural basis of so many different types of American styles of music, and then those things, coalesce into what develops through rhythm and blues, and then rhythm and blues becomes a part of the foundation of rock and roll. You know what I mean? So it's not that all of these genres are exactly the same, it's that each of them often begin in a localized, improvised, Black context, right? That may happen in the segregated context, it may happen in a more integrated one, but in either way, the power structures often mean that as soon as they come into a certain space beyond Blackness, that they are immediately sort of absorbed into the machine, figured out how to restructure them to become a commodity at the same time that when Black people actually take them up, they have a different meaning, right? And so it feels and looks different in the 1950s and 60s, and there's folks who may be able to sort of even better understand this when you have Pat Boone doing Tutti Frutti versus Little Richard doing Tutti Frutti. Well, one of the things I try to point out here is that what Black sound also as a concept means is that there are property questions here. Because what does it mean that you can keep taking up these like Black performance aesthetics, things that are necessarily written down, but that become like the basis of what is written down, that then becomes like the sheet music and the vinyls and things that get the rights to be copyrighted, and that's where you get the real ownership. You know what I'm saying? And so, damn, where was that going?
What?
Sorry, y'all.
All right.
Well,
Amen.
you know what you make me think about, and I think I already gestured to this in my Instagram stories. You know, because what the hell is Cowboy Carter then?
Yeah.
An appropriation of the property relation,
Yeah.
or is it really the root? And I want to say that out loud,
Yeah.
but also I want to read what I wrote in relationship to that. You know, so you talk about these easy assumptions around authenticity versus mimicry. And then you move beyond them, right? You think with Saidiya Hartman about terror and enjoyment as another kind of dyad. But there's also this moment where you sit with the distinction between authenticity and sincerity, following John L. Jackson, particularly as it relates to this notion that there can be a sentimental approach to minstrelsy that doesn't, revolve around the construct of minstrelsy as property. Right? It's always going to be a property relation, in other words. When we're talking about the music, you call music part of the industrialization of America in the Gilded Age. And so I want to talk about this sort of idea of copyright, or ask you about this idea of copyright, and how that influences popular music and culture, and how does this idea of copyright challenge this notion of authenticity, especially, as I just said, in this age where artists are using wealth in their positioning and their marketing prowess to claim that they're reclaiming something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Can it really be reclaimed if there's only a property relation in its origin? Yeah, especially if you're this is so the question around sort of property and copyright and authenticity and all these things, like this is where the concepts get a little complex, and I get confused myself even when I'm talking about it and writing about it. So I have to be very clear. But I want to try to make it, to sort of suggest, to say first that one of the things I'm trying to point out here around Blacksound is that one of the reasons that the whole industry itself, right? I don't know how many music makers, like musicians we got in the, all right, any musicians here? Okay, all right. So, but we all listen to and consume music, right? So when you go onto Spotify or you go to Apple Music or you go to any other platform that may be streaming, right, which is the sort of mainstream way that we consume music, the people who are getting the money, you always hear artists, even big time artists say, we ain't getting no money from streams. Well, why is that? And that's everyone across the board, right? Well, the reason is because the people who have ownership over the rights of music are the people who own the property rights themselves, and property rights can only be given to sheet music, right, and to things that you can copyright, which are in a fixed medium, meaning that either a vinyl, right, or you've written down some lyrics, and those are your copyrighted lyrics. They can't be duplicated without your permission, or you've written some actual sheet music, right, and then that becomes your source of property. Otherwise, it's 50,000 people who have the producer and this person and that person. They're all getting a cut. But the main cut comes to the people who own the rights to the music itself, right? And then that's often these larger companies. Well, that starts in blackface, okay? You talk about the masters, right?
Yeah, exactly. That starts in blackface, where even though performance was happening, people are making money off of live performance, right? Where the real money starts to happen is when the industry begins to use sheet music as the main source of music property in the 1830s, right? So books, maps, these other legible forms of property are what copyright law was initially designed for. It was not designed to protect the sounds of people, because the most original sounds being used for music property were the sounds of Black people. So why would they and their sounds, if they are considered to be property, why would their sounds be seen as something that is of value to be protected for them, rather than something to be taken and used and assumed to be public domain, for example? So I'll give you one clear example about that, and we'll get to these masters things. But there's a reason that, for example, the blues scale, okay, the 12-bar blues or the blues scale, the harmonic system that is at the basis of a lot of early 20th century music that then becomes the basis and is also part of like gospel music and like all these different musicals, ragtime that develop into pop music, right? Well, that scale, the sound of it itself, is considered to be part of the public domain because it does not have the quality of being fixed in some way, right, that is recognized by the law. So copyright law is like, okay, this thing that was innovated by, Black Americans, 100 years ago, has no real value, even though it's the aesthetic and sonic value of so many different styles of music over time, right? So this is what I mean by what does it mean to sort of account for this loss of like property that really isn't considered that under the law, especially when we talk about putting together these sort of arguments around things like reparations, right? And so just in terms of music, like right now, you can again own the lyrics, you can own the sheet music, and you can own the vinyl, the physical recording itself. And so what that is generally called is the master recording, right? And so one of the figures that I talk about in this book that Josh pointed out is a man by the name of George Washington Johnson. He was he was enslaved in New York, gained his freedom through after his dad was emancipated, right? And I think I have some. And he becomes one of the first recording stars of the late 19th century. So like in the 1890s, when Thomas Edison, right, invented the phonograph, which was first made for, like secretarial sort of work, right, informational work. Then it became a commercial technology that one of the very first commercial recordings to emerge from Thomas Edison. Let me just see if I can pull this up right quick. That is, okay.
You have to sign in one more time.
Oh, okay, I see. All right. So, okay, here we go. Yeah, here we go. All right. Now let me pull the screen up. Okay. So this is George Washington Johnson. Who we are looking at is literally one of the first recording stars in the United States, which means he's one of the first recording stars in the world, right? Because this was the sort of hub of early recordings. When George Washington Johnson, formerly enslaved man who was also a street performer in New York City, was heard by a record producer who worked for a subsidiary of Thomas Edison's phonograph company, right, the New Jersey Phonograph Company. And I'm sorry, not of Thomas Edison Phonograph Company, but of the New Jersey Phonograph Company. And they bought the rights to Edison's phonograph to use for commercial recordings. And so after one sort of popular recording by a white band, of like three members of a white band that he paid like $3 a piece to make one recording of, and then sold it and it became popular, the record executive, white male, was looking for someone else to record. And remember hearing this street performer who was very popular at the time in New York City. And so he contracts George Washington Johnson to record a song called The Whistling Coon, which was a coon song. A coon song is a derivative of blackface minstrelsy in the late 19th century. And there was basically blackface tunes set to the new ragtime aesthetic that becomes like the basis of Tin Pan Alley and all of Hollywood and all these things, right? So George Washington Johnson, this like early black performance innovator of ragtime, was then contracted by a early white music industrialist to record a coon song written by a white vaudevillian minstrel performer, right? A coon song which is sort of taking these ragtime aesthetics by black people and stylizing them and using broken dialect and negative images of blackness to then become a source of entertainment for the populace. So what happens is that George Washington Johnson's recording of The Whistling Coon becomes so popular, maybe I'll play it real here.
Alonzo song by John.
Okay, so there are two things here. One, it's hard for us in this moment to sort of like really be able to receive what's happening because the sound is very different, the imagery is very different. But what's happening is that in the earliest part of the recording music industry in the United States, right, the sort of first popular recording to be distributed amongst the masses to help to inaugurate recording as a commercial venture was, again, a coon song coming from minstrelsy written by a white performer, performed by a black performer, who then put his own innovative practices into this song under this sort of, again, stylized racist rubric, but somehow this is the venue through which like black performance is entering into the public. It also becomes the first commercial success. And so in the last decade of the 19th century, he records anywhere between 20 and 50,000 of these recordings. Now remember, okay, at the time, these are phonographs. Phonographs are those big bell-shaped, you can only record one at a time. So this is the origin of the master recording, right? The original recording. He pressed these by having multiple, so basically this man was enslaved, right, to the phonograph recording to inaugurate the recording industry through this coon song, using his performative innovations to help popularize these sounds to the white masses that then become the basis of how people begin to imagine being able to market and commercialize vinyl recordings as the basis of the modern music industry. You know what I mean? So how do you get out of that? You know what I mean?
So why doesn't he become a rich man?
He doesn't become a rich man because he does not own the masters, right? So eventually, by the time, like he died in the early 1900s or early 1910s, and by the time we get to like 1909 and recordings become easier to make because there are gold master recordings that can then be duplicated. So this was like 10 years after his initial recording. Then the recording itself became totally detached from him altogether. And there were Europeans performing. Like there was a version of this in like the 19-teens that sold 1 million copies in India. You know what I mean? His name was nowhere near it by that point. You know what I mean? Because the record companies are the ones who own the rights to the work themselves. Because again, vinyl recordings were not considered to be a source of property aside from the people who pressed them and distributed them, because it was a matter of who had the access to this technology. So these pressing record companies become the larger record companies that we know today, who own the MP3s to the, who own the masters to the things that are circulated right through these larger services.
Before emancipation, this was also happening in relationship to the form of minstrelsy. And you could go back in time a little bit from, the turn of the century and talk about the emergence of someone like Master Chupa, who gives this form at least a perception of authenticity because of his body, because of what he looked like. Talk about his legacy.
Yeah. So I have like a million blackface presentations and different, we all have different iterations of things, and I'm trying to see which one. Here we go. Yeah. So, and so let me, just to make sure that we all, fully understand that blackface minstrelsy is the first original form of popular music in the United States. So there was like all kinds of folk music happening. Africans in America were making all kinds of music locally. Native indigenous peoples were making music. Irish, Scottish, English folks were the first original form of American music to develop on this soil to then be sort of pitched to a larger group of people for commercial entertainment was blackface minstrelsy. And it began with mostly Irish American men, but also English, Scottish, German, darkening their faces with burnt cork and performing Irish and English folk tunes. So like the early blackface tunes were actually like Irish and English and Scottish tunes, but through what they call broken dialects, because it's supposed to sort of represent, someone who is not literate, who doesn't have any sort of like sense of humanity, right? But then also to a certain like expression of the body that was supposed to be outside of the realm of like the proper white male citizen, right? And so like the movements and the posturings that were assigned to these characters like Jim Crow, essentially became the way that white Americans like liberated their own bodies without having to like take on the same beatings that those movements mean when they were put on black people. We can think about that today with like TikTok, right? And so like we can walk outside, we don't even have to move, okay, and be accosted, right? And it doesn't even make a difference. But you know, someone can get on TikTok and do all kinds of dances that are coming directly out of a particular tradition, and then like get 1 million followers, and then have a whole sponsorship, and then they're like on the red carpet at the Met Gala. You know what I mean? Meanwhile, you pop out on the street, you're liable to get shot. You know what I mean? Like it's, so this is the sort of early iteration of like taking up either ideas or real blackness through performance that like both allows for people to live in certain ways and allows for a whole industry to be built. But William Henry Lane, because blackface began with white men primarily in blackface, William Henry Lane was an anomaly in that he was I suggested he's like, you know, the very first iteration of what we consider to be a pop star, superstar, like Michael Jackson. Because William Henry Lane was a black performer who P.T. Barnum, right, the inventor of the three-ring circus, right, who Charles Dickens, the English writer who wrote, what did he write?
Great Expectation.
All of the things. He also wrote about Master Juba, right, because he came to New York in 18... Right, yeah, exactly. He came and wrote this book called American Notes in 1842, where he is sort of trying to get the sense of what America is and take it back to England, and like, this is what the United States is. And who he writes about and spends a lot of time writing about is this figure of William Henry Master Juba Lane, who in these areas called red light districts, so DC would know something about that in these other areas too, but for a very long time in the 19th century, you know, before drinking, before prohibition, you know, became overturned and such, you know, it was in the sporting districts or red light districts that people would go to enjoy their vices. So gambling, right, drinking, sex work, all these things were happening in vice districts. This is also the place where music was being made. Like, this is the story of the development of ragtime in the later part of the 19th century, right? So William Henry Lane is in one of these halls in Manhattan that is actually owned by a black proprietor. This is in the mid-1830s, 40s. And he's dancing around, and we can see this etching of him dancing from 1842 after Charles Dickens writes about him. And essentially, William Henry Lane is one of the first black popular entertainers to have an international career. He totally sort of reshaped the way that minstrels at that time, the white minstrels who were imitating blackness, this is when you begin to have more, quote, authentic blackness on the stage. But how authentic is that blackness when it's already an inversion of oneself that one then has to rescue or reclaim through challenging these, you know, assumed notions, while you also happen to do it to the gaze of the primarily white audience and folks who sort of manage the whole scheme of things, right? So Lane is written about over and over and over in like London newspapers, papers in Scotland, papers in Wales, papers all over the United States, but especially in the Northeast.
The obsession with him.
Obsessed with him, right? So it was
As an exotic figure.
We could think about, you know, how this runs sort of parallel to all of the sort of like the development of these exhibitions that were happening in Europe, right, and in the United States, where, you know, the sort of colonial encounter also means that you're organizing and judging bodies based on your sort of idea of relationship to animalia and to these things that are sort of, again, outside of the category of a white, proper male citizen, you know, hetero, WASP, right? So Protestant, all these things, right? So it's connected to citizenship and also goes back to property ownership.
And this is in the liberal United Kingdom.
And in the liberal United Kingdom, and as a matter of fact,
period, and they're kind of like
in the Victorian era,
right?
my man performed for Queen Victoria. Okay, like that's how big William Henry Lane was. And so what happens is that, you know, he basically invents what we call now tap dance in many ways. And he becomes, you know, he really helps to sort of shift the trajectory that blackface was taking after it developed early on in the 1820s and 30s, and then in the 1840s and 50s, it becomes really sort of a solid form of theatrical entertainment that really bases so many different forms of American styles at the time. And then, from his interjection, and as we move towards emancipation, you have more and more Black performers who begin to do, and again, we're only 12 to 13, whatever, percent of the population, but the music dominates the landscape. This began then, you know what I mean? But it began already from an inverted place of the musical sort of contributions always being sort of under the rubric of being both exploited and racialized by the folks who are in control of the larger system.
And I think it's actually connected to the quote unquote advances of the natural sciences in many respects, because you get what they see as an entertainer, but there's also this idea, here's a natural specimen of the nigger.
Yep.
And they actually say that in one of the pieces.
Yes.
Here we have a natural nigger.
Yeah. As opposed to an imitated one, which they wrote about regularly. They were like, we do not want to see Black people perform Blackness on stage. We want to see white people perform whiteness on stage. White people perform Blackness on stage. Again, we can think about how that factors so much into today. Now, for example, I am a person who can appreciate all kinds of voices and people, but I also see what we think about. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I want us to be more critical and smart consumers as well, right? Because in this age of media saturation and disinformation and all these kinds of things, the point is to get us to absorb and consume things without thinking about it, right? But to force one to think about what their sort of musical, how their musical tastes are also shaped by so many cultural factors that then can lead to, how you can, again, support or lean into a really shitty person who is not really doing anything for the culture, but you imagine it because of the way that all these performances have been so baked into like the commercial structure that is made to really fool us into, not really thinking well.
I don't know which metaphor to use, whether it's seeds or threads, but there's so many things in like just that UK example that I think, deserve further exploration, like the whole coloniality of the situation. What does it mean that quote unquote American popular culture becomes part of the imagination of the colonial other? The idea that was this the one that was the one in United Kingdom who was part of the Ethiopian serenade?
Exactly, yeah. That was the name that, again, as you said,
Right.
associated with eugenicists and sort of the colonial encounter with something. Ethiopia was the name for Africa, right? In terms of like sort of how Europeans decided that it was all one continental country, right? As Ethiopia, and so like the first minstrel troupe were the Virginia Serenaders. Well, them fools was from Boston. You know what I mean? So they're using Southern, references. They're recreating the idea of what these nostalgic, just like in the same way that they rebuilt or they built all of these, monuments to the Confederacy in the 1910s and 20s. Not during the war was lost. You know what I mean? Like they weren't erected during the loss of the war. They were erected to sort of reconstruct what an American legacy and history is in the 1910s and 20s. At the same time that we erase all of these, legacies, of where these things come from.
And it also recalls the work from Cedric Robinson when he talks about the film and theater industry in the United States. But that book begins in England.
Yeah.
It begins there.
Yep.
So what if we begin to consistently think about the fact that these are not just racist constructs in the domestic sphere of the United States, they're colonial and racial constructs at the same time.
I mean, England had the black and white minstrel show on TV until the 1970s. It was like a mainstream, or like one of their most popular variety shows. They won many awards, right? And it began, right, when the Windrush generation got to the United Kingdom. So how does again, from William Henry Lane in the 1840s until the 1940s, right, where syndicated television becomes the main thing. And you can trace every version of American entertainment to blackface. Television, film, radio, all of it, right? We can do that easily. But again, in the United Kingdom, by the time you get sort of syndication of popular, like a lot of early Hollywood was musicals, because the musical comes out of vaudeville and Broadway, and that is the basis, and Tin Pan Alley, and that's the basis of early film in Hollywood, right? That becomes the basis of the early film industry, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. So radio, television was based around music and performance. That's because theater was a primary source of entertainment before you had digital things before you had mechanical reproduction, right? So it makes sense in a lot of ways that by the time you get to the United Kingdom, that the black and white minstrel show, because slavery didn't happen in the same way, because their slavery was across the pond as opposed to in their backyard, right? There's a different idea, as you're pointing out, that we don't have racism in that way, or it's different. Well, it's still based on the same anti-black shit, stuff. Pardon me. You know what I mean? Like,
Say it right.
It comes from the same place. So it's so. In the United States, there's no way that they would have, even though it still happens, but a minstrel show by 1972, it just would not have happened. You know what I mean? Because by then, on mainstream, but this was the BBC showing this up until then, until, again, black activists just like here were like, listen, y'all, okay, this is just ridiculous now. Are we really going to keep showing this shit on television? Like, really? But it was such a part of their fabric of making this. Like, they joked about the Queen, on the Black and White Minstrel Show. They talked about politics, because that's what minstrelsy, even in the 19th century, allowed for, again, all kinds of ideas of self and citizenship and community to be imagined while using blackness as a ruse and while inhabiting it. And what I'll talk about at the same time that they were literally consuming black flesh, right, through, as Vincent Woodard writes about, right, they literally were consuming black flesh during slavery, but they also were consuming our interiority, right, to become, like, how does the flesh become commodity, and how does our interiority become the same expression of a sense of that, you know what I mean?
So I have a musicology question. First of all, I appreciate the inclusion of sheet music and notation in the book, because it allowed me to kind of count out some of those rhythms as I'm thinking about this, and it's this is immediately familiar.
Yeah.
And I never associated that familiarity with, for instance, the coon song.
Yeah.
There's one part that really blew me away. The ice cream truck song.
Yes.
It's a coon song.
Absolutely.
What?
It's one of the original. It's Zip Coon.
Right.
It's one of the original blackface figures of the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
I mean 18th century.
Yeah. So I want to ask this question. The irony of the concept of ethnomusicology is that the word ethnos corresponds to the other. That's what the word means, the non-normed. So it's interesting to me that the very idea of popular culture, at least in the U.S., incorporates the assumed other through Blacksound. At one point, you even cite Toni Morrison's idea from Playing in the Dark about the Africanist presence. So I'm wondering, in your estimation, how much of Blacksound is discernible or legible within Western approaches to ethnomusicology? And do you anticipate that your work will have an impact in how music theory is approached or not?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Wow. Because, so ethnomusicology is, so I'm a historical musicologist, right? And then within music studies in general, there are these different fields or areas, right? One, musicology or historical musicology, which is the study of the history of music generally. Ethnomusicology, which is the sort of anthropological or the study of a group of people or community of people and how they make music, right? And then there's music theory, which is the analysis of music, the chords, right, and all those structures. And then there's music composition, right? But so my actual training is in historical musicology, so the book itself is very historically based. But my work, because my work is related to Black people, right? But it's actually, again, what I'm talking about is American music, so it's related to a whole bunch of different folks, right? But because of the word Black, and because Blacksound, and because I very clearly am Black, and because I talk very explicitly about Blackness in my work around these things, because you can't get around Blackness in the context of the United States, right? The sort of idea that I guess I'm actually leading into, right, this flattening or this assumption, because it's how does the study of American popular music also become inherently about the study of the music of the other? And the other in this case being Blackness, because it is inherently central to the development of the whole thing in the first place, right? And so to your question around how does this shape or impact, one of the things I was doing, I have very clear political intentions around the work that I do, period, right? Because for one, I feel like I was put on this earth to do a certain job in particular ways, and I was called to do things, so I try to answer that call, right? And so like I have no problem being explicitly clear that, you know, when I say the Blacksound is a political project, it's a reparative project, meaning that I'm trying to, you know, work along with, you know, legal scholars and lawyers and people who make pitches to congressmen to change like copyright laws and such, right? As well as folks who are doing on the ground work towards reparations. So from a musical standpoint, how does this work contribute to that, you know what I mean? But also in an explicit way, I think what I'm also trying to like really lean into within my field of music studies, right, is there was a whole movement. So like we would know this very well here in this space. So you know, with things like the Black Athena controversy that happens in like the 80s and 70s and 80s and 90s, right, where Black folks at Howard, at Morehouse, where I went, right, scholars and historians and all these folks were like, look, you know, we know that something is very serious about Nubia and Egypt, and we want to understand and unpack this relationship and also understand how these things are connected to what the Greek, like they were really breaking these things down. And so we also, like, there was a whole pushback to that around like racial essentialism, right? So tried to act like the work that people were doing in those moments, which was critical work, which is a moment where Black scholars were really left out of the academy in so many ways, unless they were at HBCUs, especially if they were studying these subjects, right? But making these, you know, very strong sort of claims. Well, there, 70s, 80s, you know, in the 90s, there's this critical theory thing, and I feel like in musicology, basically what happened was that there was a really key moment where Black musicologists like Eileen Southern, who wrote a book called The Music of Black Americans, people like Samuel Floyd Jr., who wrote a book called The Power of Black Music, like these folks wrote foundational studies that my work is based on, that people who have tenure track jobs, who define the field, act like they don't exist, right, when they write about American popular music and culture and these other things. And so what I'm making clear is that if you try to do that without referencing and talking about these works, then your work is shoddy, because you can't separate race and Blackness from your discussion of American popular music. And if you do, then you have to give some context for how and what you're doing. Otherwise, if you would, so what I hope is that at this point it'll make people be like, well, you know, I gotta address the pink elephant in the room some way, even if it's just to say, there's a big elephant in the room. You know what I mean? Like, you're not gonna get, because what was happening is that white people just getting the jobs on the study of Black music who were not writing or caring anything about Black people. And that was a problem for me. You know, but I can't do anything about that directly. But what I can do as a scholar, right, is make sure that the work is strong enough that when you engage with a certain discourse around American popular music, you've got to come across Morrison, right? Whether you agree or not, I don't care. Right, but you're gonna have to reckon with this thing that has been ignored for too long in the mainstream sort of discourse in a critical way, and not in a way just to say, "Oh, I talked about it. That's cute," or "I represent this person." Oh, that's it. Like no, like you're dealing with people and human beings who have been living, who have lived lives, and you're gonna acknowledge that if you're gonna deal with their creative practices.
I've always found it odd that theory is separate from composition, which is separate from historical musicology. Right.
Yeah.
How can these things be separate?
Yeah.
And it's my hope that your work touches on those other areas. Yeah. Because I think that there are people, in particular, Black composers who need this in the way that they not just take on the technical aspects of the practice, but also as I just interviewed. I just interviewed Terrence Blanchard, and he was talking about what it took to write these operas that he's written 2 operas, working on a 3rd. And he said, you know, my composition teacher told me not to write an opera, but tell the story. And what you're doing is telling the story, but also the story that you're telling, it has enough of that. Connection to the technical aspects that will transform what you produce. And so when I talk to musicians, this Terrence and other musicians, they talk about this need to inject honesty into their work. Right? That is so important. And I think what you've done in this book is force people to reckon with the thing that they lied about for so many years.
Centuries.
I was going to say
No, again, have, someone like Joshua Myers, particularly within Blacksound, a particular place like Howard, you know what I mean? Like there are a lot of folks, a lot of us, who work in various areas in the field of Black studies and such, but not a lot of folks who do that at an HBCU and like fully committed to doing so. You know what I mean? And so I do appreciate that because again, it's good to talk about the work, but the work has major political stakes behind it for me. And so it's really wonderful to sort of receive that back to hear clearly, like the way that it could potentially be used, even in, from a musician standpoint.
I'm taking it over to the art building myself.
Yeah.
It's not already there. It's probably already over there.
Yeah.
Because it's such a critical intervention. And I'm taking it to the English department, and I'm taking it to the African studies because it really, like I said, like when you think about race beyond just this narrow notion of Black people overcoming and somehow becoming American, it's more complicated than that.
Way more complicated.
Your book takes us through that journey in a way that allows the historical context. And when you talk about Jacksonian democracy in the book about music, right? And it's make those connections, and you are able to show that nothing is abstracted from its wider context. In the United States, the wider context is white supremacy. It's governed by white supremacy. And that doesn't mean it's going to look the same every time you see it. It's going to morph, it's going to change. Now, if George Washington Johnson was alive, he probably would be rich.
Yeah, you have no.
Right.
Yeah. And Mike can get other dudes to record coon songs so they can get rich too.
Right. So there's a shift. But the master narrative hasn't shifted.
Exactly.
So
I think that's really important too, because when I'm pointing out, like people have asked, like an interviewer coming up was asking me, they were like, can you give me an example of like a Black person, like a contemporary Black artist who has been exploited, like in the system you talked about? I said, well, yes. But what I'm actually trying to point to is that any person, because it's just like, this is the thing that ignorant racists don't realize, is that they test it out on the most disenfranchised first. And then it goes to everybody else once it works on those, and people will make a fuss about it. So the whole industry, right, has been created off of this exploitative racist system that now everybody has to figure out how to navigate through. Absolutely. You know what I mean? Now it does play out still, in least favor for those who are the most disenfranchised still, right? But in the end, the whole system itself has structured itself off of that type of, racialized exploitation that then becomes sort of just the standard that everyone has to somehow like negotiate.
that question that someone had, it made me think about what happened to the session musician over the last 40 to 45 years in terms of exploitation. That was a whole occupation. Now it's not.
Yeah, no, it was a whole occupation, especially not now with with certain developments around AI and how AI is being allowed in the same way. So AI is like another iteration of blackface, right? Think about what, in terms of creativity, right? One of the things that I have sensed that we are so fascinated that this non-human object can duplicate, not create anything, right? Can duplicate things as much as a human can. Because you imagine this non-human object doesn't have the same capacity as you, human being, right? Whatever that means for you. Well, what was blackface, right? This sort of idea that, like the fascination with seeing someone else inhabit this thing that they imagine doesn't have like a human capability or quality in the first place, right? You know what I mean? It's like the fact, and then that translates into, again, I was about to say something around like someone like, like it's hard to ever be like some of Adele's selling records, right? Mm-hmm. And I like Adele's voice. This has nothing to do, like I can like or dislike it. That ain't got nothing to do with the reality of why Adele is so big, right? It is because of the access and proximity to sounding, right? Not even just sounding black, but sort of just taking up a whole litany of references and them becoming your person that then resonates to a whole bunch of people, black and otherwise, who then interpret that as like something even more interesting, that's happening because it's coming out of that particular body. Absolutely. You know what I mean?
From blackface to AI, the game ain't changed.
It really does not.
So I want to invite the audience for questions. Yeah. know that was an abrupt turn.
Yeah.
But yes, I know y'all got questions. Yeah, Tracy.
Okay, hey there.
Hello.
Hello.
Pass you
Thank
my
you
mic,
for the
Tracy.
conversation. Thank you for the conversation. It's just very intriguing. Just really never sat and thought about it in this way. It's so methodical. And so, of course, with within the latest discourse with Beyonce and country music, and then of course that brings into light other genres of music, right? And how it's traced back, like where's the origin? Because there's some race wars going on
Yeah.
in and around this. Like, no, this is a
100%.
white thing, it's a black thing.
Yeah.
No, you understand this black thing. You know, and so going back. So how does that connect? And I remember one time OM3, Otis Moss the third.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, with his Blue Note or something, he connects something about that the history of blackness and the blues and the Blacksound
Yes.
and music. So I just wanted to have an idea what you think about that and how does that all connect.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful question. I think you will also get to some of the nuance of what I'm trying to run through here is that how do we get to these ideas of authenticity in sound and race, right? So like why is there such an investment, right, from a particular demographic of white people who imagine themselves as very American, right? Why is there such an investment in country music, right? And the sound of country music, especially when contemporary country, half of it is on the top of the charts, is literal trap country music, right? Like if you listen to like half of what's on the country charts, it's like, wait a minute, y'all tripping over Beyonce and half of your country music is literally trap country music, right? But to kind of go back here, like how do we get sort of so invested in, or even with Black Americans? I mean, it's different in that way because of the lack of what I'm talking about here, sort of lack of recognition of one's claim to property, right? But then also like why is there such an investment or an interest in someone who is non-Black, right, doing styles that we attribute authentically to Blackness, right? But specifically with country music, what is very interesting about country music is that, so my man, not him, but George Washington Johnson, right? So, those recordings happen from like the 1890s to the 1910s. This is still when like phonographs and wax cylinders, it was still hard to like really record stuff well. And by the time we get to the war, this is when you get vinyl, right? And so then vinyl really becomes the sort of basis of the commercial recording industry, right? So what was the first sort of like vinyl, like earlier recordings to be pressed and then like receive commercial distribution was a genre called race records. Race records was basically any music made by and for Black people, okay? And specifically, it was associated with the blues. The blues at the time, which was heavily connected to early jazz, right? And minstrelsy and vaudeville, right? And ragtime. And so, you got Mamie Smith, Bessie Smith. Queen Latifah did a movie once playing Bessie Smith. Well, these were the early blues queens, right? Black women, queer women who were up singing about all connected. They're talking about, oh, these girls relate. Have you heard some of these songs from the blues era? Okay, like, give me a break. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, make sure to answer your question though. So early blues, was coming out of this blackface vaudeville style, but was really being cultivated by Black musicians for Black people. So it had a very different trajectory, right? But also that was like classic blues, but there was also this style called the country blues, right? So, still using a lot of the same kind of chord structures and melodic kind of patterns, but a different instrumentation and different narrative. And so this is what we associate with like the B.B. King, right? Bluesman or Robert Johnson. Well, again, stylistically and musically, there are many relationships between these styles, and at the same time that blues music was developing, again, it ain't just happening just Black people, right? It is happening alongside in relation to it is being led by, cultivated by, developed, innovated by Black performers, but it's traveling right away, right? And so, especially in places like in places throughout the South, right, urban areas, right. So Jimmy Rogers, for example. Jimmy Rogers is one of the first hillbilly musicians, right? One of the first country musician stars, right? Who was directly, learned guitar from Black Americans and from a particular Black American blues musician was Jimmy Rogers, who also right, was a mountain man, right? And so Jimmy Rogers is playing, within this blues style that he's learned from Black musicians, from incarcerated musicians, from localized musicians, right? And then he's developing his own style. And then he's also in his sort of like context of working class, white, Irish descendant, Scottish descendant folks who are incorporating the yodel, which itself is not Irish or Scottish, right? But it becomes a symbol of a certain style of like sonic whiteness, right? Mm-hmm. So then they begin to like take the yodel in with this blues sound and a little bit more sound that's connected to the sort of Scotch Irish like string band sound, and that's how you get the emergence of hillbilly into country music, right? Mm-hmm. However, the musicians themselves were again either working along directly with or directly influenced by Black blues musicians, and then you also would have early on in those recordings both Black and white musicians in both the blues sessions and in the hillbilly country music sessions. But when they were marketed specifically to and as Black music for Black people in these urban areas, or white music for white people in these rural areas, and then the themes and the ideas around that became so invested in American nationalism, and then the industry of Nashville and country music, which is still one of the last sort of strongholds of a certain kind of like American music industry controlled by the before, you know what I mean? Like there's a whole, there's a whole construction around this thing that again began much more complicated as we're talking about here, but the narrative of who it belongs to becomes very much a part of the larger American nationalistic project of white supremacy,
which is a product. And I think at the end of the day, I can't understand these things absent the way that they've been created as products. Yeah. And the only way to inhabit this ecosystem as an entertainer who can make a living is to accept that at some level, right? You can accept it as, being the rebel to the project, but you're still selling it, right? Yeah. Or you can accept it as, I'm just, creating it. Yeah, and so I find it very interesting, especially, I saw Rihanna Giddens last month, and she did like the Archie Shepp version of I'm gonna take you to every Black music in her set.
Yeah. Like, on the banjo. Yeah.
On the banjo, on the violin. She played like a fiddle. with everything. I mean, she had all of this going, and it's like that takes more than just I'm trying to sell you something. Yeah. Even though she is doing that at the same time, it's more about I want to show you something. I want to invite you into something. Like it was that openness to the full range and the full expression of like all the Black sounds. Mm-hmm. And that takes a lot of dedication and care alongside the skill. Like you have to want to do that. Because she could have easily, and we were in Tennessee, we were in Knoxville. Yeah. She could have easily given them the country show that they wanted. 100%. And they would have been eating from her mouth, her hands. Yeah. But she said, no, I'm gonna give you the banjo. I'm gonna tell you what this banjo is.
Mm-hmm. So I want to also go. No, that's a great way to sort of set this up, because the question too around the sort of reception of Cowboy Carter, right? There's a whole lot going on there. One of the parts is very clearly that white is what I just talked about. Why why a certain demographic of white people are so vitally against it, sort of taking Beyonce again, because it's been constructed as this thing that really defines who they are from an identity perspective that's attached to sound and community. You know what I mean? And then one of the things that's interesting too is that again, there have been Black country musicians as long as there has been country music, right? They can't get away from it. And even the Carter family, so they're one of the early like country music families, right? They directly learned a number of songs from a Black musician, right, who wrote the songs, and then they were able to publish them and get credit for it. You know what I mean? Like there's a whole legacy here. But even
KFC and bourbon whiskey all over again.
Oh, exactly, for real. And then, so we get a little bit closer in time here. So Hee Haw, how many people here know the show Hee Haw? Hee Haw is like the Black and White minstrel show, sort of a derivative of the minstrel show. So in the minstrel show, when its full form was made up in 3 parts, right? It was like the introduction, then what they call the olio, which was the middle section. It was like basically a variety show. So it had comedy. It's Saturday. Think Saturday Night Live. It would have songs and sketches and comedy, and then you have the closing sort of grand plantation skit, which really kind of breaks off into what Hollywood and Broadway becomes, right? Like the grand sort of spectacle sort of things. So Hee Haw is basically that middle section, like our early version of a sketch comedy show that again is based in music and often like having to do with like racialized identities and peoples, right? And so on Hee Haw, which was coming directly out of blackface, then also, man, there's so many things to say, but country music also comes out of this barn dance, right? So barn dance being the radio, it was a radio program, and the radio program of barn dance comes out of like literal localized barn dances that became sort of like community building spaces for rural white Americans, right? Where they were doing that in blackface also. So they making up all kinds of music and dances and line dances in black. So all of these things are connected for so long, right? Then we get to Hee Haw, which becomes one of the most popular variety shows of the 1970s, right? And so they featured here the very first black woman to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, which is again connected to the barn dance, right, and the radio show. Like the Nashville country music system is so tight, right? And so Linda Martell is her name. So Linda Martell is one of the names featured on Beyonce's current album, right? Linda Martell also has a documentary that her granddaughter is making on her life. I'm just trying to figure out how the documentary is still raising funds, and Linda Martell is on Beyonce's album, but we can pay that off anyway. Let me not get into their business. But anyways, so Linda Martell here, whose granddaughter is again making a documentary on her life, was the first black woman to perform at the Grand Ole Opry in the 70s, right? Was one of the first sort of like country music stars of that era to begin to like, along with Charlie Pride. I don't know if you know Charlie Pride, but Charlie Pride, who was a chart-topping black musician. And let's also not forget that people like Ray Charles, the Supremes, black folks were making country out. Tina Turner in the 50s and 60s were making country albums that were topping the charts. So all the stuff they're making up is just made up, right? And they just mad. Look, I don't stay mad, but the facts don't show anything different from what it is you're experiencing at all, right? Anyway, I just wanted to kind of point back to Linda Martell to play this little clip of her singing in 1970s in Hee Haw, and she since has retired completely because of the racist backlash and vitriol that she retreated from the public side because of the racist backlash and vitriol that she received, much like the girls and the guys that Beyonce featured on their album, the kind of stuff they've been getting back from certain country fans. Linda Martell completely retreated from the public scene after kind of breaking through because she just didn't want to deal with the racism. But at any rate, this is Blacksound in the sense of it is an amalgamation of all kinds of sounds that actually also show in many ways how even various different sounds are based in some conception of or imagination of like a black performance practice.
Linda Martell.
Take it out with Becky.
Living and working in the city, I thought I was a leader. Oh, I felt so smart and my own life I was free. So last night he found myself a city boy and one night stand. And the next night it leaves her sitting with a back in something. You're if I really was my girl, I could turn him to you're instead of sitting there crying with a bag in some
Anyway, I just wanted to bring her into the space. She's also very alive and well. Let's be clear. But yeah, just waiting on somebody to fund her documentary.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for answering.
Damn, next
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your work, I appreciate it. I was wondering, what are the foundational songs that forms the Black Sound?
Thanks for that. Yeah, so the foundational, I'll start with maybe foundational sounds and then like kind of move into songs. So the foundational sounds at the basis of Black Sound, it begins again in the 1820s and 30s, right, during the sort of approaching antebellum period. And because it was invented and began by mostly Irish, English, and Scottish musicians, most of the tunes were Irish, English, and Scottish by origin early on. But the difference is that as they began to articulate those tunes, they did so both through imagined and their sort of observations of Black performance practices. So you're starting with the sound that is starting with Irish and English and Scottish folk music that's then being sort of remixed right through their interpretations of Blackness, both real and imagined, that then eventually over time becomes more and more shaped by actual Black performance practices, right? That commercially are still primarily being shaped and controlled by those who are in power to help define the commercial genres, right? So there's no one specific, and then the songs that began Black Sound really are Zip Croon, Lucy Long, and Jim Crow, which are the first three archetypes of Black Sound, and they each all have their own song. You would actually recognize Zip Coon because it's, as Josh mentioned, Zip Coon was written somewhere in like the 1830s maybe. Zip Coon is supposed to represent the sort of like northern dandy, so the Jim Crow was supposed to represent like the enslaved plantation darky, so basically not being a human being as a man, right, and being a servant, being decrepit, being over-sexualized, being stupid, aloof. Was Zip Coon emerged, right, as we get towards emancipation, and there's a fear of like Black freedom, right, in terms of white people. And so Zip Coon sort of emerges as this like city slicker dandy character. I like to tell you very quickly here. And Zip Coon you would recognize because again, the 1831 tune was a traditional like Scotch-Irish folk tune known as Turkey in the Straw. The song that today still plays as the song for the ice cream truck, right? Yeah, so this is Zip Coon, Lucy Long, and Jim Crow. And so again, these are and what really made these songs stick and attractive to the general like again English, Scottish, Irish, English, American white audience was also the way that they incorporated dance into the movement. So they were again performing what their stereotypes of Black movement was, as it also like freed their bodies up to move in ways that they were not expected to as white people. You know what I'm saying? So now let's skip forward. For example, how does Black Sound shift? Okay, it begins in that context where it sounds primarily like English and Irish and Scottish folk music. That's then, incorporating some of these new improvised versions coming from some idea of Blackness. By the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, Black sounds, two words, began to dominate Black sound. Meaning that the more we get towards emancipation, the more you have Black people traveling and migrating throughout the country, the more that their musical practices are developing and being sort of duplicated in urban centers, the more that you have people going for entertainment and coming in contact with Black music, the more that actual Black music develops. So then that's how you get ragtime as the first sort of commercial sound of popular music to emerge out of this legacy that then becomes both used as the basis of cool songs, but also as the basis of like a whole bunch of 10-pound alley pop songs at the same time. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a naughty bit of an answer, but that's sort of how to think about the way that Black sound comes together. And I think one of the points from analysis here is that if you want to really understand how Black sound is functioning, you got to look at the moment and put the things together to like reconstruct it to see whether it's today or whether it was 1820. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you so much for the conversation today. I really learned a lot. I'm sure the folks did too, so thank you. Sorry, I have like eyeliner running into my eye. As you guys are carrying on in this discourse about the spectrum of authenticity and
Yeah.
sincerity,
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think about looping in the idea of legibility and the fight for legibility into that conversation as well.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could speak. I haven't read the book yet. I'm really excited to. So I don't know if this is something that you've already talked about in the book, but I was hoping that you could speak to the genre of blaxploitation
Interesting.
and similar genres that kind of reclaim the inversion as you worded.
Thank you for that. That's a fantastic question. So the book itself, intentionally, I stopped at the dawn of the recording era because I want to make, again, a point around how everything that we have now in this digital and recording, mechanical, reproduced format comes from the sort of legacy of live performance that has not fully been recorded. You know what I mean? Like, so the book stops pretty much at the dawn of the recording era for that reason. But I'm really very much trying to set a foundation right to then begin to think about what does it mean as we sort of consider the different iterations of pop music and cultural development all the way from that moment until the current or the present. So with blaxploitation is interesting because again, remember, blackface only ended. So another thing is that people really, the U.S. really be trying to play this amnesia card. Like give me a break. Blackface was the most popular form of entertainment from like the 1840s until the 1940s and 50s. You know what I'm saying? And because civil rights activists were so adamant and clear about being able to clear this stuff up, it was a great opportunity to sweep it under the rug like it never happened, right? And so, but what's interesting though, especially in relation to your question around blaxploitation and such, right, is that no matter what, as I tell when I'm in front of mostly white audiences, one of the things that I make clear when I show this screen here is that I have to sit here and contend with the legacy of these images as I'm sitting here in conversation with you because there are all kinds of things that you can't even fully control, rehearse in your head that you have to deal with from the legacies of these particular characters, right? And so, how that pans out in the blaxploitation sense, I'll take you to an example of a song called "All Coons Look Alike to Me." I got a slide for that too. That slide's for everything. I've given so many times. There we go. The song called "All Coons Look Alike to Me," written by Ernest Hogan, who was a very famous and popular black musician. Again, remember, black folks could not really enter the popular stage because Jim Crow and lynching and racism. You know what I'm saying? Like there wasn't you could, but not really at the large level unless you were allowed, and the only allowance you had is if you did it through blackface, right? So blackface became the first primary vehicle both for black performers, for a lot of women performers, a lot of Jewish American performers who entered into sort of the entertainment space in the 1890s, who were coming in as immigrants, right? Entered into blackface, right? In a similar way, but different way that black people did, because it was the basis of American pop music and culture, right? So, at any rate, from the time that blackface emerges, these images and these sort of ideas of blackness are rehearsed so frequently, just like on TV and in different ways now, that they begin to stand in for, right? And so, by the time that someone like Ernest Hogan comes along, and there are very few opportunities to really make money. So, George Walker, Ernest Hogan. There's a whole team of Ada Overton Walker. There's a whole group of these black creatives, basically. Okay? William Marion
Who lived down the street.
William Marion Cook. A whole group of these black creatives, at the turn of the 20th century, right? Who are in New York, especially, and they're trying to make black theater. The only way they can get money to make black theater is to make some money through popular music, and one of the most commercially viable ways to make popular music is through coon songs, right? So my man wrote this coon song, "All Coons Look Alike to Me," it helped to kick off what they called the Year of the Coon Song, 1896. Black composer, now 1896, it is, right? And so it's actually owned, so the song, he writes the song, and at that time, just like now, the publisher, aka record company, were the Whitmark and Sons, and so they bought the rights to the song, And so then they own it once they buy the rights, and then they distribute it. So it becomes a wildly successful song. And they keep going to negotiate it with him because to keep it popular, they keep wanting to perform it. But they're not paying him for rights to the song because they own it. They're paying him to perform the song to keep it popular, right? So the song becomes so popular that it's like I don't know, like Tyler's Water, or I don't. It's hard to equate down. You know what I mean?
Pharrell's Happy.
Pharrell's Happy, yeah. If y'all remember that, my gosh. But the difference is that this popular, this viral song was also a song that said all coons look alike to me. Okay, so you have like there's an account I write about in the book where like a police officer at a race riot in like New York City, right, or in Philadelphia, somewhere in the north, is being like interviewed, and it's like, you know, what happened? You know, how come, you know, somebody was accosted? He was like, well, you know, hell, all coons look alike to me, right? So that's how trickled down, right? This impact was. So we already have, and again going back to when you hear me Lang, so we have as early as blackface really became popular, black performers who are having to contend with the images that are already placed before them, right? That one, commercially, you're on like it only allows you commercial entry, right, in certain ways, and then it also gives you economic entry to then potentially do other things, right? So in terms of blaxploitation, it's interesting because it both one comes with the Black Power movement, so it's a certain level of pride in blackness that will in certain in like overt blackness, right, and like powerful blackness, right, like kick you in the face type blackness, right, or you know whatever, pan great, you know what I'm saying? And so there are ways, and there are also great books. There's good work about this. There's a particular. I would love to be in contact. Matthew Morrison at NYU. But I think that there is a book on like blaxploitation and like these legacies, right? But the larger point though is that for me, I understand that era, right, as a way it was one, Hollywood was racist as hell. Right? And so it was one of the ways to both sort of draw on, it was one of the ways that sort of developed in relation to the moment, right? The moment of a certain type of like badassery of blackness, right? That went along with certain shows. It was also a musical moment because blaxploitation film was directly connected to like soul and funk that was emerging in this moment. Like they were thought of really kind of collectively, right? And then also blaxploitation is interesting because there's a certain like female women's empowerment that's embedded into it in ways that, again, still sexually exploitative, still gendered and misogynoir shows up in ways like, but it's, for me, blaxploitation is interesting because it becomes sort of a foil, but and also no matter what, it doesn't matter how one presents oneself, I can be dressed like this, I can be dressed in an all black hoodie, white supremacy sees me the same way, you know what I mean, I'm still the same person, okay? And so so I don't want to like also suggest that, like I would never want to suggest a performance of citizenship in a particular way to get you more access to citizenship. I don't believe that at all. So there's a way that blaxploitation was in many ways like a response to all of those years of like blackface being the dominant sort of way that black folks were represented. Because blackface was also popular in black communities, like the Chitlin Circuit, right? I was actually talking to my grandfather recently. I was like, how are you just not telling me this? And you know, I wrote a whole, we talked all the time about it. He was like, yeah, we used to go down there and see the little minstrel show. What? What do you used to go down there and see the little minstrel show, sir? In the 1940s and 50s. And you didn't tell me about this until the book is done. But he was like, well, but it was interesting because he was like, as little boys, like we didn't see them as doing anything negative. We saw them as celebrities because they would come to town. You know, they would buy stuff, you know, they would let us hang out with them between, because, you know, these are like traveling shows, right? So they would be hanging out with them and stuff, you know what I mean? So I feel like, I guess I'm saying that to say, like, the blaxploitation fits more squarely into, like, what's happening culturally within the black space, right? In a lot of ways, but it's also a way, an answer to Hollywood that is both exploitative and exclusionary, whilst trying to figure out how to get put into these networks through these images that they are also inverting in ways. You know what I'm saying? Like it's way more naughty than some people like to give it credit for, again, because of these ideas of not just respectability politics, but anything that doesn't present black people in a particular light is seen by some as to be. It's like, no, that's white supremacy, baby. That's not how black people represent themselves.
Thank you.
I mean, we're also at Sankofa, so there's many people that can answer that question.
Yes, also.
Filmmaker Central here.
Yeah.
Any more questions? You want to wrap it up?
Sure.
All right. Any final words?
Thank you all so much for being here. This felt very wonderful. It's nice to be in this space. Nice to be, as an HBCU alum, as an AME, as a very Black Southern person. It's really wonderful to be able to share this work and this book in this space with y'all. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to Josh and to Sankofa and to Michaela as well. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you all.